Nice Lord's Day. It was really nice outside, and me and Lou went out. Seemed like every 20 minutes she was wanting to go outside, so we spent quite a bit out there. So it was a good day. So, and it sounds like the rest of you had a good day. So it's very nice to have one of those every once in a while. For a lesson tonight, I came across an outline talking about Aquila and Priscilla, and I thought, well, hey, I've never actually heard a whole lesson on Aquila and Priscilla. So I borrowed this outline and thought we would examine that and make some practical applications at the end as we kind of examine what the text reveals to us about Aquila and Priscilla. So in doing so, we'll examine the different passages, Acts 18 verses 1 through 3, Acts 18 verses 18 and 19. Then we see him mentioned again in Acts 18, 24 through 28, 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 19, Romans chapter 16 verses 3 through 5, and then finally their final mention of them is in Paul's closing comments there in 2 Timothy 4:19. So as we can see, Luke and Paul both have them mentioned multiple times throughout the scriptures, and so obviously Aquila and Priscilla made an impact on those individuals. If you've ever been to a going away luncheon or going to a formal place where they recognize people or whatnot, usually people who make a major impact on somebody are usually mentioned by name, and then a general compliment to the masses for the impact that they had. And that's not saying that everybody didn't have a good or bad impact on them. It's just that some people are more exposed to individuals and they have play a bigger role in their lives. And so it's obvious when it comes to Paul, Aquila and Priscilla made quite an impact on him. And then we'll wrap up tonight's lesson on lessons learned. So let's begin by looking at the text, and we'll read from Acts chapter 18, and beginning there in verse 1, it says, "And after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked by occupation they were tent makers. And so not only were they companions of Paul, but they were also in the same occupation, and that'll be one of our observations. So, just cliff notes now. What we saw there was that when we first meet or hear of this couple, Aquila and Priscilla, we find that they're from Corinth. We also Luke reveals to us that Aquila was born in a region called Pontus, which is the northern portion of Asia Minor. Having lived in Rome, they were banished from there with all the other Jews by Emperor Claudius, and this would have been around 41 to 54 A.D. And they were tent makers, the same profession as the Apostle Paul. It doesn't mention there that Paul was a tent maker, but we find recorded later in Paul's letters that he was a tent maker as well. And with this meeting of Aquila and Priscilla with Paul, we have the beginning of one of what some would consider the most dearest relationship mentioned, or friendship, not relationship, but friendship there in the scriptures. You might make an argument, well, what about the 12 apostles and Christ? What about their friendship? Yeah, but I mean, we're talking about, we're talking post-resurrection or in the New Testament epistles, if you will. And where Aquila and we can't necessarily say that they were Christians already. We know that they were of Jewish background, but it does not mention that at this point in time that they are Christians. But we could probably infer, if you will, that probably that they weren't. If not, they would be before they left the city of Corinth. They would definitely be Christians by that time frame. And so that's the first recollection that we have of this couple, Aquila and Priscilla. And I did start. The next few verses later, there in verses 18 and 19, we see, so Paul remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed to Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow, and he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. So this is the second mention that we see here of this couple. And we see that they had departed Corinth with Paul and went to Ephesus with him. We also find that Aquila and Priscilla and remained there when he journeyed on to Jerusalem. And that's what we find in verse 21. If you look there in verse 21, while we didn't read it, it says, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. So Paul departed from them for a short period of time, or for a period of time, but nonetheless, they went with him from Corinth to Ephesus. Next, we find just 3 verses later another mentioning of them. It says, and this is probably the most common reference that people often when they make it a point about Aquila and Priscilla and about what they had done or whatnot, this is usually what they refer to as this text here. And if we read this, we find there, beginning in verse 24, it says, Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born of Alexandria, an elegant man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. When he desired to cross Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting to the disciples to receive him, and when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing that the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. So in this series of passages, again, like I said, this is the most probably quoted time reference to Aquila and Priscilla as far as what they've done in the Gospels. But we see at Ephesus, they heard a preacher named Apollos who only knew the way of the Lord, but he only knew of the baptism of John. After hearing Apollos, we find that they took, and this is a direct quote, they took him aside and explained to him more accurately, or they explained the way of God more accurately. From this incident, I think we can learn a lot from this couple. They knew the truth, And however, Apollos at the time did not know the full revelation of the truth. And they were courageous enough to endeavor to teach him that which he taught in error. And, and I think that's the key. I don't think that's an over dramatizing what they did. It would take great courage. It does take courage to approach somebody and say, appreciate what you're doing, but you made a mistake here. And as we talked often before, even a lot of people, especially, I know at least my time in the military, you put somebody up in front of people and you tell them that they make a mistake or whatnot in front of a bunch of people, or made a mistake in front of a bunch of people, they usually get offended, or some do. Not all. Some receive feedback quite well, and I would say that's how, being a Christian, Apollos would have received it, would be quite well. But we need to realize that, not all people receive feedback well, so it takes courage to go and tell somebody, hey, you made a mistake. And that should be a reminder to us when somebody does garner up the courage to approach you to say, hey, you made a mistake. We shouldn't be offended that they're pointing out a mistake. We should actually thank them and be thankful that they did have the courage to approach you and correct you in their error. There's nothing to be proud about when it comes to evangelizing the gospel. It's all about teaching the truth, and we need to teach the truth accurately. So if we make a mistake and somebody points it out to us, it's no big deal. We just make an adjustment and we move on. Nothing to be offended about. But realizing human nature, they did. I do believe that it was courageous that they approached him. They taught him in such a manner not to embarrass him. I would say if they made an incident out of it, Luke would have recorded it as such. That because Luke records in other areas where there was an uprisal of the brethren. He may not call people out by name, but he usually elaborates enough that we can find out that there was tension there within the congregation or in amongst that conversation. That was one of the good things about Luke and his recordings is he often caught the emotions of what was going on. And this should also be a teaching moment to us that when we go and point things out to people, to approach them in meekness and not haughtiness, because people are going to be more apt to listen to you if you approach them humbly as opposed to approaching from a standpoint of arrogance or kind of making fun of somebody. That's not going to get us where we need to be. They loved souls to the extent that they took time and effort to teach him the truth. And that's really, the essence of what they were doing. They were, saving his soul as well as those that were hearing his message. And so they were distinguishing the expressions from the truth. So it was, I think, and that's why we often point out this section about how they did that. And that's something that we need to. This is an incident or happenstance that we need to put in our toolbox. That when we find out about those things, that we can approach people in a like manner. So we might start asking a rhetorical question, since this is a teaching moment. What would you have done? What would you do now when you are confronted with teaching that is inconsistent with the truth? A lot of people, well, I'm sure somebody else heard it, so they'll point it out to him. They don't take the time to, or nobody wants to confront the person or the individual. I have here, adopt the course of least resistance and say nothing. Thinking like, and I got ... So much today, I think people want to avoid conflict, and they go about it so much to avoid it that they allow people to continue in error. And that's not something how we should not, again, as we talked about this morning, we need to be courageous with our evangelizing, and we need to be courageous in ensuring, especially the alien sinners, that they know the truth of the gospel. And so when somebody is saying something in error, again, we don't need to be arrogant about it, but we need to be truthful about it, and we need to be courageous enough to approach people who are teaching such an error. So I have up here, it wouldn't do any good anyway to go and correct that individual. So why am I going to waste my time? He's going to get mad at me, so why bother? If that's the mindset, we're not doing you're not carrying the name of the Christian very well, I would say. Or on the opposite side of that, you're willing to, and I've seen a lot of brethren do this right here. They make a scene, and sometimes they get angry, and even resort to calling others names. That's not correcting somebody. That's making a spectacle of the situation. We're not going to get anywhere if we're going to go about correcting people that way. We shouldn't make a spectacle out of it. We may not see that so much within the walls of the congregation, but a lot of times people, when it comes to sitting down with people that are from different denominations or have heard of a perverted gospel all their life, or they're in the midst of a mixed Bible study, and somebody from a different, like I say, from a different background is preaching or teaching an untruth. Yes, granted, we need to point it out, but we don't need to go about it to make a scene, get angry about it, and then resort to calling people names. There's nothing to be gained by that. Consider Galatians 6:1. We need to lovingly seek to correct. And if you look over there in Galatians chapter 6, it says, Brethren, if a man is ever taken in any trespass, you who are spiritual restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself less, you also be tempted. But I think the key there is to restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. I think the saying is you'll get more flies with honey than you will, with how's that saying go? Yeah. So and that's true. It's very true. So we need to go about correcting all people in the correct manner, and to do it with a spirit of gentleness. Doesn't mean that we don't boldly proclaim the truth. We certainly need to boldly claim the truth, but we need to do it with the spirit of gentleness. I got here, just as Aquila and Priscilla, we must stand for the truth and seek to correct the error. And that's the bottom line. Whenever error is being taught, we need to speak up and be willing to put forth the truth. Doesn't mean that you sit there and argue till you're blue in the face about the truth. Again, I don't know how much you're going to avail by doing that, especially if you have people who have never heard the gospel, but just speak boldly what the truth is, and if it falls on deaf ears, it falls on deaf ears, but at least you've spoken the truth. Next, we find them mentioned over in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 19. It says, "The churches of Asia greet you. Aquila, Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord with the church that is in their home." While that might be just a short phrase, I think that tells us a lot, again, about the character of Aquila and Priscilla. We see that when writing to the Corinthians from Ephesus, again, it would have been in around 53 to 54 AD, the Apostle Paul extends a greetings from Aquila and Priscilla. They obviously knew people there at Corinth, and no doubt they too were eager to see the church at Corinth to be more spiritually minded. Then I have here that there was a church in the house Aquila and Priscilla implies, and again, that's what I think that is so profound here about this instance. We find out that they were hosting a church or an assembling of the Christians there within their homes. Their homes was open to the Christians in the area. It could even be used as a meeting place. They were not so concerned with their earthly possessions, but they could experience and practice the way of the Lord by permitting the church to meet in their home. And now, does that mean that we all have to open our homes and have a church home movement or whatnot? No. But if you have opportunity, then sure, of course. But the willingness to do so, to extend hospitality and to ensure that that people had a meeting place to come together. Of course, this was at the stand of the church at the time, and there wouldn't have been resources to have their own meeting place and whatnot. So we find that Aquila and Priscilla, they took their resources and they made them available to everybody to come and to meet in their home. And so I think that would speak that is in their house. Greet my beloved Epithemus, who is the first fruits of Achaia to Christ. So as Paul closed the Roman letter, he sends a greeting again to Aquila and Priscilla in Rome. They had obviously moved from Ephesus back to Rome by that time. They did not leave their religion behind, and they had not forsaken the truth, the church, or Paul. He says, "My fellow workers in Christ." Again, he's pointing out, just how big of an impact that subtly, but obviously they made a big impact, and they were definitely wholehearted Christians. And he points out that they risked their own lives or their own necks for his life. And the Lord said that man could not give no greater gift than to, either risk or give his life in defense of another man or person. And so, obviously, they were willing to do so for Paul. And if they did it for Paul, I'm sure they was willing to do it for all the Christians there. He was thankful for them, as were all the churches of the Gentiles. So obviously, not just a few people knew of Aquila and Priscilla, but many of the people throughout the region. Of course, they had traveled around with Paul and would have been there standing up a lot of these churches. And then we also see it's quoted, "Greet the church that is in their house." Once again, mentioning that they're having people come to their home. And as it has been in Ephesus, a church was meeting in their house. And has anybody watched the movie Paul? Has anybody ever seen that? It's worth watching. But there's a scene in there where Luke, where the setting is Paul's in prison in Rome, and Luke's going and talking to Paul on a daily basis there in the prison, and Paul's like dictating, like Luke is one of the writers. Obviously, he tells Paul that he's working on the Acts of the Apostles, which would be the book of Acts. But he's also recording what Paul would have him to record there in his last living days. But there's a scene that cuts to where Paul is talking to Aquila and Priscilla, and it doesn't mention that they're in their home, but they're all in hiding, and they're kind of back behind a wall, like in a little courtyard. And I don't know for sure, but I would say that this might be the illusion that the director had in mind when he went in that scene where Luke had gone to Aquila and Priscilla, getting resources and food and stuff, and then also talking to people that they were trying to evangelize there. So I would say that the setting was there in their home. It doesn't say so, but it was a gathering of a bunch of Christians. It's worth watching the movie. If anybody can't watch it, let me know. I can probably share my password and let you watch it off my account. But it's a decent movie. We also see that everything said about them was highly commendable. Again, there's no rebuke. He's always talking favorably. Points out that they love the truth, and they love the Lord. They love the church, and they love the people. Obviously, they love the people, and they were loved by others. And in your handouts, I think it says love the Lord, or love the truth and love the truth. There's a mistake in the handout, but I caught it on my slide. Now we go to 2 Timothy 4:19, and this is the last mentioning of Aquila, Priscilla, and Paul's writings, as well as the rest of the New Testament epistles. And it just simply says, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of..." I sat there and hit the play button. I couldn't tell you for about a good 10 minutes. And it's pronounced exactly the way it's spelled. So it's one side force or force. There's something along that line. See, I'm butchering it, but it's pronounced the way it's kind of spelled. It's a long E, a long I, and an FORUS. Of course, it's real easy to pronounce those things when you're hitting the play button and you're sitting right there. But then when I get up here, it's get tongue-tied. This is the final, like I said, this is the final mentioning of Aquila and Priscilla in the Scriptures. It is a brief statement, and Paul salutes them in Ephesus, and he quote unquote he says, "My fellow workers in Christ." This was Paul's last letter, yet amid all that was happening in Paul's life and on his mind, because I don't think we can say that his time in prison and knowing that he was going to be put to death, that things weren't on his mind. He took time to record and to remember them. Again, think of all the people that Paul had came in contact with, and in one of his final letters, these were the couple that he remembers, and one of the only few that he mentions. So again, I think that just speaks to maybe there's not a lot of words that mentions the impact that they made on him and as well as others there during the time of the standing up the New Testament, but obviously they did. So those are all the passages that speak to them, and whether it's recorded by Luke or whether it's recorded by Paul about Aquila and Priscilla. Now let's see if we can, we've already talked kind of about some lesson learned, but let's just, these are some that came to my mind, and as well as some from the outline that I borrowed this from. So he says lessons to be learned is the oneness God desires in marriage, I think, is emulated in Aquila and Priscilla. We see them always working in unison as a couple, and it appears where there was one, there was the other. So Jack and Jill, or however you want to put it, they were a couple, and they were both working for the betterment of the church as well as for spreading the truth of the gospel. They were obviously industrious. They had possessions. They had a home. They opened up that home. They traveled. They went out and about, spreading the gospel. They were tent makers. So they were quite resourceful individuals. So multitasking to the nth degree, if you will, again speaks to the impact that they had. Next one I have up here is their friendship with and support of the preacher of the gospel. Yeah, and preacher's probably not the best word. Paul was an apostle. He wasn't just a preacher. He was like the preacher. Back then. But nonetheless, I don't think that they would have showed any more favoritism towards Paul than they would any other Christian. Looking at the different instances, look what they did for Apollos when they heard him preaching. They took him aside to teach him more perfectly. They opened up their home for others to come in, and of course, we know that they aided Paul in his work. Again, their home was hoping to extend hospitality towards Christians. They took their religion where they went. That's something that probably a lot of people don't do today. A lot of people, when they go on vacation, they go on vacation from church as well. And then they knew the truth and were courageous enough to contend for it. And that's what we saw in that example with Apollos. As well as where it's mentioning we read at the beginning that the Jews were exiled out of Rome by Claudius. And, Claudius didn't like the Jews, so I doubt if he cared much for the Christians as well. But again, that didn't stop them from opening up their home to have a church there at Ephesus as well as in Rome towards the end of Paul's time here on earth. And so I think, I would hope that we'd all be that courageous if we're given the opportunity. So that's the lesson. So in conclusion, we examined all the passages, and then we talked about some lessons learned. Obviously, these were above average Christians. To have them mentioned so many times, but just because they were above average, that doesn't mean that we can't be above average as well. I'm not saying we have to be above average, but we all have talents, we all have different resources, and however we use those resources, we should utilize them to the fullest for our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, as well as our Father who is in heaven. And I think Aquila and Priscilla is an example of individuals who used all that they had been blessed with to the fullest extent to further the gospel. And that's probably the biggest lesson learned that we could gather from them, and to try to emulate in our own lives. So just quickly, some final thoughts before we extend the invitation. And the spirit of ask that rhetorical question to yourself. Is that spirit of Aquila and Priscilla in me? Is it in you? And then as you answer that to yourself, if not, why not? That's a great question. If not, why not? That's for you to answer. I don't need to know that answer, but the Lord knows that answer. And one day we'll all have to give a recollection for the things that we have done here on earth, or a recollection for the things that we didn't do that we should have done. And that's where that if not, why not comes from. But the bottom line is, the Lord and this church here in East Cambridge, as well as all the churches out there in the world, need such individuals as Aquila and Priscilla. And there's nothing that should be preventing us to be like Aquila and Priscilla in our own lives. So that's the lesson. I hope it was profitable